Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast where we make experts great again, contribute actively to the public debate and policy making around energy, geopolitics, and trade. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. It's January 9, 2026, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. My guest today is Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, a career diplomat who now serves as Senior Manager Director and on energy and critical minerals. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources and previously served as the US Ambassador to Greece and Ukraine, among several senior roles at the State Department. Two key countries that we will discuss also today. So we are going to have a fascinating and discussion on a fast evolving topic, energy geopolitics in the East Med. And I'm very grateful because we know right now it's all about Venezuela and Iran too. But we're going to focus still this week on East Med because this is a region that is increasingly intertwined with Europe's energy security and broader strategic dynamics, connected also to developments in the Levant and in the Middle East. So more than a decade ago, natural gas discoveries in Israel, in Cyprus, but also in Egypt, and with renewed interest in offshore exploration in Greece, they began to reshape economic links and cooperation across the region. And with a strong US backing and active diplomacy, the East Med Alliance, also known as the 3+1, has taken shape and has endured. So even survived the recent war in Gaza and even doubled down. So there is clearly a momentum. We've seen also a renewed deal between Israel and Egypt on gas recently. And Greece is very intentional about developing its own gas resources offshore. So gas at the beginning was the common ground, but it has expanded also to technology, to military cooperation, to all kind of other, and electricity also, additional electricity potential interconnections. But there are things that keep me at night, and I'm very also curious to hear what our guests will have to say about this and potential spoilers that could disrupt this alignment. And chief among them could be the intentions of Turkey and Qatar, whose sometimes the ideology and the strategic economic interest may not align with those of the 3+1 framework. Also, we've seen that Egypt and Israel, sometimes their partnership is more like a cold peace. And broadly speaking, for me, after the invasion of Ukraine, I have a broader question in mind, which is, will the interdependence on the economic side and regional trade will always prevent war and bring stability? So with all that in mind, welcome, Ambassador Pyatt.
Thanks, Leslie. Happy to have the conversation and great topics.
Great. So before we zoom into the East Med broadly and Greece specifically, there is a rewiring of the energy system in Europe following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In that context, how do you see the positioning of the East Med gas to solve some of Europe's energy security problems?
So I think your intro hinted at the multifaceted and multi-layered aspect of Greece's role in remapping energy infrastructure across the East Med and Southeastern Europe. Greece is in a geopolitically critical position. It is Europe's linkage with the Levant, with the Middle East, with North Africa, but it also is the key gateway to the Balkan Peninsula, to Southeastern Europe, to the Black Sea, and to Ukraine. And as we think about what's happening today in Ukraine, the war will end. And when the war comes to an end, the center of gravity of European geopolitics and geoeconomics will shift decisively to the south and the east. So the strong energy alliance that we have between the United States and Greece is absolutely central in that regard. I was very proud to lay the foundation for a lot of this work during my 6 years as ambassador. and then to sustain it during my time as assistant secretary. But it's also part of the work that I'm now doing at McClarty Associates. And I'm glad to see that Ambassador Guilfoyle, the Trump administration, continues to double down in this regard.
So it really means, it really means that there is a strategic positioning here for Greece to become this hub. Sometimes you hear this word as a hub, but we know also that Turkey has the same ambition too. Can you talk little bit what it means to be this getaway and being a hub for all those different energy resources, but also connections?
Right. Well, and I think they are not mutually exclusive. So Europe, and you highlighted this, has made a huge geopolitical shift. The determination, which the Commission has reaffirmed at the level of President von der Leyen, to end all Russian LNG into Europe by the end of this year. And what's especially important is this isn't just the 6-month rollover of sanctions. This is European law. So it will endure regardless of what happens in Ukraine. And then equally, the determination to end all Russian energy flows by 2027. To achieve those goals, Europe has to build new channels. This is why there is such an important synergy between the huge growth in American LNG. And of course, we're going to have a doubling of US liquefaction capacity over the next couple of years, and also the growth of European regas capacity. So the United States is putting a lot more LNG on the water. 70% of that gas for now is going to Europe. So Europe is the major destination for the US Gulf Coast liquefaction facilities. So Greece, of course, has expanded capacity in the Revithoussa terminal, in Alexandropoli. Gas Trade and the Kopoulousos Group are looking at a second FSRU in Thrace. But Turkey has also significantly expanded its regas capacity. I think 5 new terminals since the full-scale invasion. And for the United States, our strategic objective is to get Russia out of Europe. That's been a bipartisan U.S. strategic energy goal going back several decades, and it's continued through the Obama administration. It was part of my work when I was ambassador in Ukraine under President Obama, through the first Trump administration when I was representing the United States in Greece, and of course through Biden, and now through Trump too. And you saw that as recently as last fall during the PTEC conference in Athens, where you had a huge U.S. government delegation, Secretary Wright, Secretary Burgum, and Jared Agan, the head of the National Energy Dominance Council, all there delivering a message of U.S. energy and the decoupling from Russia.
So once U.S. LNG and other potential supply arrive into Greece, then they have to free flow to the rest of Europe. Do you think that Europe is in a good position right now, and a lot of progress have been made since the invasion of Russia? Are there still works in progress in terms of interconnectors? And we know that Greece regasified LNG could potentially go up to Ukraine, right? Can you talk a little bit about this?
So yes and yes. So Europe has made great progress. In Greece, during my tenure as ambassador, we worked intensively, and I was working with Washington to bring to completion the Southern Gas Corridor. That's a project that has involved 2 decades of U.S. diplomatic support. And the TAP pipeline, the last piece of the Southern Gas Corridor, was completed only in 2021. So just in time to help Europe ride out the cutoff of Russian gas that came at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. During my time as ambassador, I also worked very closely with my counterpart in Sofia, with Ambassador Mustafa, to see the completion of the IGB interconnector, which connected that Southern Gas Corridor to the vertical corridor, the Trans-Balkan gas pipeline, which, as you say, today has been used to move gas from Greece, north through Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova to Ukraine. DTEC, the largest private energy company in Ukraine, has played a critical role working with companies in Greece and the Greek government, but also with Lithuania, with the Klaipėda terminal, in order to develop these new routes. But we're talking about rewiring Europe after 3 decades of dependence on Russia as the principal source of supply. And I want to emphasize this isn't just about gas, it's also about power. Because Europe is decarbonizing. Europe is using a lot more electricity. Europe, like the United States, is building up its data center capacity. So the ability also to expand transmission. And there again, Greece with huge renewable resources. There were days last year. In fact, I was in Greece in April of 2025 on days when 100% of Greece's power demand was satisfied through renewables. And that's going to continue to grow. And then importantly, and we'll talk about this later on, but importantly also the opportunity to build power interconnections into the Levant. So the Gregi power interconnector from Egypt up into Greece and then into the European grid. But once all those electrons get to Greece, they're only worth something if they can be transmitted onwards. And that's more infrastructure that has to be built. So just like in the United States, where we struggle over high voltage transmission lines and infrastructure build out, Europe has to do the same.
Right. That's very interesting. As an ambassador and, in the State Department, I'm sure you had to answer to some of the critics that a few years ago we kept hearing, especially at the time of the Nord Stream 2 saga. It's that the US is only interested about selling its LNG to Europe. But the fact that the East Med is also developing its own gas resources and that the US is so supportive kind of dismiss all those critics.
So I'd say two things. First of all, I can tell you in my role as the State Department's senior energy official, but I can also speak for Secretary of State Blinken on this one. We were not focused first and foremost on selling US molecules. That was a benefit. Our first focus was Europe's strategic autonomy and the risk of dependence on weaponized Russian molecules. And that was US policy that really went back as far as the Bill Clinton administration to the Bush administration. The United States has been sounding the alarm about that dependence on Russia for many, many years. And then on the East Med, what I would emphasize is two things. First of all, as your lead-in noted, we've seen a dramatic transformation of the energy map in the Eastern Mediterranean. First of all, the emergence of Israel as a major gas producer, completely energy secure, but then the ability to use that energy as a driver of cooperation. And we also have one of America's biggest companies, Chevron, as the main producer in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Chevron has a huge interest. And when I was in government, I worked closely with Chevron to support their work with Egypt, to support Chevron's work in Jordan. So you have pipelines that are helping to supply Jordanian power requirements, which take advantage of Israeli gas. You have the capacity for Chevron to do even more. And as you alluded to, you also have Cyprus as one of the other frontiers, another market where Chevron is a major player, but also some of the Europeans. And then you have Egypt as a major demand center, a country that has been a producer for many, many years, with a large gas industry, with a lot of gas-based power, with a fertilizer industry, with a very large requirement for food. And again, you have Chevron involved on the ground as a major player in that market as well. And a lot of what I did at the State Department was thinking about how we leverage the role of American companies and America's energy resource to advance our national security interests. And that's, I think, one of the really important changes that's happened in recent years. And frankly, Vladimir Putin has accelerated that, is how we think about America's energy abundance as a national security attribute.
The recent deal that Egypt and Israel have signed to expand their gas cooperation, and Israel and Israel exporting more gas to Egypt was not a done deal. It took more time to be signed. It was controversial in the domestic market in Israel because of fear of maybe running out of gas. I think the US put a lot of pressure for its, seeing the broader region and what is at stake and wanting to keep stability between Israel and Egypt. Can you talk a little bit about where Israel and Egypt stand and what it means for the region to have this broader cooperation and making the deal kind of more permanent?
So 2 points. First of all, looking at energy comprehensively, power, electricity, transmission, and gas. Second, from under both the Biden administration and now under the Trump administration, you've seen American diplomats, our ambassador in Jerusalem, our ambassador in Cairo, myself from headquarters, working to facilitate the cooperation. Ultimately, these are commercial transactions. They have to be developed between companies. But the United States, certainly in the Biden administration, when I was in charge, was very, very forward leaning in our support, for instance, of Osama Mubarak's and the East Med Gas Forum, viewing that as a venue to help facilitate these conversations, which look at energy not as a zero-sum transaction, but as a driver of cooperation. And I think you see it's clear, first of all, the whole world needs more power. And in the decades ahead, we're going to need more gas, we're going to need more renewables, we're going to need more electricity. But you also see an increasing willingness to look at these cooperative frameworks. So you mentioned Qatar Energy, for instance. And I saw just this week that my friend, the Egyptian energy minister, was in Doha meeting with the Qatari energy minister and the CEO of Qatar Energy, Saeed Al-Kabi. So there are a lot of shifting lines here.
So actually, they just announced that Egypt would import 24 cargoes, I guess, around the summer.
As and you have power transmission from Saudi Arabia to Egypt. And there's going to be more of that as the infrastructure continues to build out.
So, a question for me is the economic interdependence between Russia and Europe didn't prevent Russia to wage a war on Ukraine, right? Despite having a transit pipeline.
Russia thought they were going to use energy as part of their arsenal, and they totally failed, largely because of American LNG producers.
So do you think in the East Med, the common ground of energy, power, interconnection, linkage, greater economic interlinkage will prevent to have any animosity or historical tensions and bring greater peace and prosperity for the region? And we could expand. Your department has actually facilitated the solving of maritime dispute between Israel and Lebanon. Syria now is back potentially into the fray of the nations and the region in terms of energy cooperation. I think they just have imported for the first time Jordanian gas, and we know that Jordanian gas may come from the Egypt-Israel pipeline also potentially, as well as LNG imports. So there are different, energy is a great opportunity to bond those countries together. Is it enough?
So I think yes and no. Energy is a facilitator of cooperation. It's a facilitator of business and commercial ties. It helps to create incentives on the cooperation positive side of the ledger. But it is not a guarantee against political differences. Those have to be resolved by diplomats and political leaders. Energy certainly helps, but it's not a guarantee.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, Europe started with ECA, which was also based on coal.
The European coal and steel community is the best example of using energy as a means of building confidence and building political and commercial ties. And today you have visa-free travel, you have Schengen, you have a single currency zone, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't know where these things are going to lead.
Mhm.
But especially in the early phases of a conflict or of conflict resolution, we have to be realistic.
Yeah.
But I think I see energy as a low-hanging fruit in these areas, and it's also in post-conflict situations. And you mentioned Syria, but I would also flag Gaza. So the largest power operator in Gaza was a Lebanese group run out of Athens. And in the context of Gaza reconstruction, there are huge power issues that are going to have to be resolved.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, much of Israel's gas resource is immediately offshore, including offshore of Gaza. So there
Yeah.
are plenty of issues that create opportunities in this
Yeah.
area. And I think the most important overarching point is that there's been a dramatic transformation of the region's dynamic precisely because of the energy resources that have been identified. And I think
Mhm.
it's really important, so I'll say it again, those energy resources are both electrons and molecules.
Yeah. So just to follow up on what you said, I think for Gaza, the Marine Bee field would be a tremendous resource for the territory to gain revenues and lift up its population. I think it will all depend on who is going to get the revenues, right? If it's Hamas still in power, and then not having such great intentions on how to use the money, that could be complicated. But yeah, I think it could change the whole dynamics too by bringing prosperity to the Gazan people. And the energy resources that the East Med is developing, I think um, it's very different from what Western Europe is doing, right? Like, shale gas is not really moving anywhere in France and in the UK, and there is kind of a rejection of developing any natural resources, even coal or any kind of resources that come from the ground. So all the offshore gas resources, I think it's interesting that those Mediterranean countries and Cyprus, Greece are taking a very different stand than the rest of Europe.
Right, you mentioned Greece, and I was in the room in, I guess it would have been 2019, just at the end of the Syriza government, when ExxonMobil, Total, and Hellenic Petroleum signed their original agreement. And I was very glad to see this fall Exxon moving ahead. They still have to conduct the exploration there, but you see a clear decision by the Greek government, and that decision has continued under multiple administrations in Athens to look at how to develop their offshore resources.
Mhm.
Um, there's also, but you also have a very clear determination from the Greek government to continue to develop their massive potential for renewables. Um, a very large infrastructure of wind power, of solar, of hydro. And I think it really is, we are living through the all of the above era.
Right. I was going
Everybody
to say.
understands that. And the question is not what color of energy are we going to need or use. It's how do we produce our energy in a way that is affordable, reliable, and sustainable.
Yeah. So all the above energy may look very, very different, depending on the European countries, whether it's Western Europe and some countries still have nuclear or hydro, and other countries it might be more focused on renewable plus natural gas or renewable plus coal. It's going to be very interesting developments. So there is no regional energy story without asking about what might disrupt it. And starting with Turkey, do you see Ankara more as a spoiler, a competitor, or an unavoidable partner?
So I've lived through various cycles of tension between Turkey and Greece, including as ambassador during the Oruç Race crisis, which had energy at its center. in the summer of 2020. But I also think that it's a very...
Can you remind our listener what happened then?
So this was a confrontation between Greece and Turkey, provoked by the activities of a Turkish drill ship, which was proposing to operate in the Mediterranean. It produced a confrontation between the two NATO navies. It was extremely dangerous, that culminated in a collision between a Turkish and a Greek warship, which fortunately did not produce any casualties, but easily could have escalated. So I was involved, as was my counterpart in Ankara, David Satterfield, in helping immediately on an emergency basis to try to walk back those tensions. The good news today is that relations between Ankara and Athens are in a much better position. And you have a clear determination, I think, from both Prime Minister Mitsotakis and President Erdogan to manage differences in a way that does not produce a similar crisis. There are still underlying tensions over disputed maritime claims, again, with a nexus with energy issues. But I think that's where diplomacy comes in. This is where the role of the United States is very important. And ultimately, as you alluded to in your question, Turkey is a huge regional player. It's inevitable. It will have a major, major role in the reconstruction of Syria. It is the transmission belt for the Southern Gas Corridor. You can't have a Southern Gas Corridor to bring gas from Azerbaijan to Europe without having BOTAŞ and the Turkish government at the table. And everybody understands that.
And they are still also bringing Russian gas through South Stream for now.
They are, although I must say a number of the Gazprom contracts with Turkey are up for renewal. And from my own discussions, including with Turkish Energy Minister Bayraktar, I don't think that Turkey has any illusions about the risks of excessive dependence on Russia. And it's a very good thing that Turkey has significantly increased its own imports of American LNG, with potential to do even more. I hope that we'll also begin to work with Turkey on issues of nuclear power. Turkey has a very bad deal with Rosatom, where the Russians are building a reactor where Turkey will just pay for the electrons, but all of the engineering skills, all of the work will be performed by Russian engineers. That's not very beneficial to Turkish industry. So there's a huge opportunity to do more between the United States and Turkey, for instance, in the area of SMRs. And then I would also point out that Turkey, during my time as Assistant Secretary, Turkey signed our Development Finance Corporation's largest deal anywhere in the world for the construction of wind power capacity using American technology and American hardware. And again, goes to the point about how the rest of the world has clearly understood that the way to solve energy security and energy demand questions is an all of the above strategy.
Yeah. One thing that has the expert worry is Turkey's maritime deal with Libya. That could further redraw some of the sea routes and control of the East Med. Are you worried? And do you think we should take it seriously?
So I don't have to worry about it anymore because I'm not in government. Okay. I certainly worried about these issues when I was Assistant Secretary of State, and it went right to the heart of my job because that's what the State Department does. But we also have a longstanding U.S. policy that the United States doesn't take a position on maritime differences, but we do have a strong bias in terms of negotiated diplomatic resolution. And I hope that the Trump administration will be able to continue that work because I know how important what I did in Washington and Athens was to managing these issues. And frankly, building and strengthening our alliance with Greece, which was my job in Athens for 6 years.
Yeah. So we touched a little bit on Qatar. Qatar is already invested in Lebanon, in Cyprus, in Egypt, in some of the gas fields too. Do you see Qatar also as a kind of a needed player in this region to stabilize it, or is it a quiet disruptor and there could be an axis of bad actors that could disrupt the kind of ongoing alliance and cooperation?
So, what I would just emphasize is that Qatar and Qatar Energy is a globally relevant player at this stage because they have such massive capacity. And I talked earlier about all the additional liquefaction that will come on the water over the next year or two from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But the same is true for Ras Laffan and Qatari capacity. Moreover, Qatar is also becoming an investor here in the United States with Qatar Energy's involvement in the
Yeah.
Golden Pass project. So I think that's the really important aspect of this. And as you allude to, Qatar Energy, like other national oil companies, is beginning to think more ambitiously
Mm-hmm.
about the role that it can play out of area. So those projects that you mentioned, for instance, offshore of Cyprus, those are some of Qatar Energy's first forays into the region. I expect there will be more because they have been very successful as a producer, and they're going to, like every other producer, they're going to be looking for new opportunities, whether it's in the Eastern Mediterranean, in South America. Qatar Energy is involved in Guyana, in Brazil, if I'm remembering correctly. So this it goes back to my point that we are living through a particularly dynamic moment in the global energy system, where one of the big historic incumbents, Russia, has marginalized itself through the weaponization of its resources. And I think Russia is never again going to be viewed by Europe as a reliable energy supplier. So Gazprom has lost its largest market in the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the brutal attacks, including just over the past few days on Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian energy infrastructure, are just going to reinforce the world's determination to marginalize Russia. You see
Mm-hmm.
the Trump administration beginning to roll up the Russian shadow fleet.
Yeah.
And I think we saw another Russian flagged vessel boarded by the Coast Guard today.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, I think Russia has shot itself in the foot in a historically significant way, maybe one of the greatest acts of self harm economically and commercially in the history of the world.
Yeah.
So the energy map of 2030 is going to look very, very different from
Yeah.
what the map looked like in 2020, or certainly if you go back to 2010, say before the shale revolution in the United States. The United States today, largest oil producer in the world, 13.5 million barrels a day, the largest LNG exporter. So we're winning on this one, and it's not a function of one administration or another, because as you know, Leslie, this is an industry where companies and CEOs have to make decade-long capital allocation decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So their time horizon necessarily stretches well beyond the 4 years of one presidential administration here in the United States.
Yeah. So definitely a big remapping ongoing. We'll see also what's next for Venezuela. A lot of things can happen also in Iran in the coming months and years that could bring much more energy also to the world. I would just say that it was interesting to see that I think it was in Egypt, Qatar took over some of the permits and licenses from Russia actually. And in the past, when Russia was involved in other plays that were not Russian gas or oil, it was also to be able to, in some ways, try to control the pricing and the markets and the destination of the gas. So I would just note that as a note of caution. Great. And lastly, I'm asking most of my guests, who do you think was behind the pipeline explosion of Nord Stream?
I have no idea, but I'm glad it happened.
Yeah, we all enjoy the outcome. Great. So I just have one question, which is more on your personal and professional trajectories. So you've been an ambassador in Greece and in Ukraine, actually. So you can tell us a little bit about your experience there. But I was wondering also, what do you see for the future of the job as ambassador? Is it still relevant in today's world with all the different technologies that we have now? How do you see like also the importance of soft power and relationship?
So really quickly and easily, I see the role of ambassadors as more important than ever. Diplomacy is a contact sport. It's about personal relationships. It can't be replaced by a WhatsApp message or a video call. So having both the local knowledge, the cultural fluency, the language skills, knowing who to talk to, being able to explain the policies of the United States, but also to listen. Because when I was mentoring some of our incoming ambassadors, I always said, the most important skill as a U.S. ambassador is to listen well. So I think you mentioned we started this conversation talking about Venezuela and the political transition there, and we all should be glad that Maduro is out of the way. But in terms of carrying the political transition forward, managing the very complicated politics, but also all of the energy issues, there is zero chance that we will be successful in that effort without having a strong U.S. embassy team on the ground. And I've worked in multiple U.S. embassies during crisis situations. I've led embassies in those circumstances, but I've also watched some of our most skilled career ambassadors navigate these waters. And I have no doubt that the Trump administration is focused on this question today. And if they're not already, they're going to discover that they're not going to be able to achieve the goals that the president has set out without a strong diplomatic team on the ground.
Terrific.
Great.
Answer. Thank you so much. And I hope we'll have you back soon to discuss more on the developments of all those different regions.
Great. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you. This episode was recorded on January 9, 2026. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me.